The tension between my son and my mother-in-law had been building for some time, but nothing could prepare me for what happened during that family vacation. My son, Ben, from my first marriage, had always been the subject of Freda's dislike, but this was something else entirely. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a time for everyone to unwind and bond. Instead, Freda's actions would prove just how far she was willing to go in her disdain for Ben. Without our knowledge, she took him out one day, and almost left him behind, as if he didn't matter. Let me take a step back. I'm 36 years old now, married to David, who's 29. We've been together for almost 2 years and married for 8 months. Our relationship is strong, filled with love and respect. But that's where the positives end when it comes to his mother. She's a woman who makes it incredibly hard for me to enjoy any family gathering. I try not to let it bother me, but it's impossible to ignore when every holiday is spent at her place, and I know she can barely tolerate my presence. But here's the real twist: if there's anyone she hates more than me, it's my son, Ben. He's just 7 years old, and he has to face the brunt of her coldness. I had him with my first husband, Jacob. Our marriage was far from perfect, but it wasn't because of me. It was Jacob's health that tore us apart. He was my soulmate, and I'm still grieving his loss to this day. Losing him so suddenly, to a heart attack, left a hole in my life that I'm not sure will ever be filled. Jacob and I met when we started working at the same company. We clicked instantly. After dating for almost 2 years, we married when I was 23. By 27, I was pregnant with Ben, and by 29, Jacob was gone. Ben was just 2 at the time. My world, which had already been so fragile, shattered completely. It was Ben who kept me going, though. His tiny hands gave me the strength to keep moving forward. I owe everything to him. Everything. It took me 4 years before I was able to connect with someone new. David came into my life when I was still raw from losing Jacob. He was younger than me, and I had a son. I didn't know if I was ready to open my heart again, and honestly, I worried about what others would think. It felt too soon. But David made me feel something I hadn't felt in years: hope. His kindness, his respect for me, for Jacob's memory, for Ben, it was a rare and beautiful thing. Still, as happy as I was, I couldn't escape the shadow of my mother-in-law, Freda. From the very beginning, she made it clear she disapproved of me. My age, the fact that I had a child, the fact that it was so soon after Jacob's passing, she didn't hide her feelings. She would make passive-aggressive comments, hinting that it was wrong for me to move on so quickly. And I guess that was just the beginning. It didn't take long for me to realize she didn't just dislike me, she disliked my son as well. Ben could never understand why Freda treated him like he didn't matter. He would try so hard to win her over, but she would never budge. She would speak to him in a way that was so cold, so dismissive. It broke my heart. I didn't want to make a fuss, though. David was doing his best to care for her, and I didn't want to add more stress to his life. His mother was sick, diabetes, arthritis, hypertension. It wasn't easy for her, and it certainly wasn't easy for David, who would visit her every weekend and try to make her life a little easier. He had an older sister, Frankie, but she lived too far to help regularly. David had a big heart, and even though he had hired a nurse to help Freda, he felt it was his responsibility to make sure she was okay. After all, her husband had passed away years ago, and Frankie was already stretched thin with her own family. So, I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to make David's life harder by confronting him about his mother's behavior. I kept things to myself, instructing Ben to keep his distance unless Freda initiated anything. It felt like the only way to keep the peace. But it wasn't easy. Over time, David started noticing the silence. The way I never spoke to Freda, the way she never spoke to me. The way Ben was treated when we were around her. He would ask questions, and I would dodge them. I didn't want to cause drama. I didn't want to be the one to tear his relationship with his mother apart. But that doesn't mean it was easy. It was eating away at me, but I kept it bottled up, thinking it was better for everyone in the long run. That all changed a few weeks ago when David and Frankie decided to take us all on a much-needed vacation. Freda insisted on coming along. She said she would pay for her own flight, and I didn't have a reason to object. But little did I know, this trip would open a door to a much darker side of her. The tension in the hotel was thick, the air heavy with unspoken truths. I stayed in one room, knowing Freda was just a few doors down in another, separate but in the same hotel. As long as I didn't have to engage with her, I was fine, or at least, I thought I was. But the nightmare started the moment she decided to do the unthinkable. Frankie, who had promised her children they'd be allowed to join, was unable to make the trip. Just 2 days before the flight, she'd sprained her ankle so badly that traveling wasn't an option. But she wasn't about to break her promise, and so, she sent her kids with me and David instead. David had flown us to Miami, and just a day into our vacation, Freda turned everything upside down. I was napping in my room, barely recovering from a morning spent on the beach. David, too, was knocked out beside me. The day was fading into quiet restfulness when I heard the faintest knock on the door, a knock that went unanswered. We were both too exhausted to respond, and Freda, without hesitation, took matters into her own hands. Ben, our son, answered the door, something he'd never done before. It was the first sign of a mistake. Freda's charm worked like magic. She promised Ben ice cream, a simple treat that was enough to lure him away. After all, it was the first time she'd shown him any real affection. How could he resist? He left with her, and when we woke up, Ben was nowhere in sight. Panic surged through me as I realized Freda wasn't in her room either. I called the receptionist, my heart racing. Frankie's children were still asleep, unaware of what had happened, and they couldn't shed any light on Ben's disappearance. The receptionist told us Freda had, indeed, taken Ben out for a walk. At first, it seemed harmless. Maybe she was trying to make things right. Maybe she was trying to apologize. But that hope quickly crumbled when hours passed, and Freda returned alone, empty-handed. The reality hit like a cold wave. Freda had taken our son, and now she was back, alone, with no explanation. When I saw her, my stomach dropped. The anger in her eyes was impossible to ignore. I demanded to know where my son was. She feigned offense, but, beneath her cold gaze, I could tell she was hiding something. She told me they'd been walking around, near the hotel, when Ben had wandered off. She said she couldn't find him in the crowd. I didn't buy a single word of it. Something was wrong. It wasn't just a lost child. This was something far worse. I told David we had to involve the authorities. His fury matched mine. He tore into his mother, but Freda, as always, played the victim, claiming it wasn't her fault. But none of it mattered. I wasn't going to wait around for explanations. I called the police immediately, while David and I fought off our fears and frustrations. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. It felt like an eternity, those 30 minutes that dragged on before the police and hotel staff found Ben. It was the worst moment of my life. Time seemed to stand still, each second stretching into an eternity. But when they finally brought him back, I could breathe again. Ben told us what had happened. Freda had left him at a shop nearby, told him to sit and wait for her return, and then disappeared. The shopkeeper, thankfully, had been a good man. He offered Ben candy, tried to talk to him, and quickly realized something was wrong. He contacted the hotel staff, who sprang into action and found Ben. Freda's cruelty was unimaginable. She had planned to abandon my son, all because of her irrational hatred. It shook me to my core. There was no going back from that. The idea of trying to keep peace with her seemed absurd now. I told David everything, finally explaining how Freda had been treating us ever since we entered her son's life. I had always feared this moment, worried David would side with his mother. But when it mattered most, he didn't. He was furious with her, too. The fight that followed was intense, and we pressed charges against her. But there was a complication. Since we weren't locals, the court proceedings would be a hassle. We decided to leave the hotel, moving to a new one far from Freda's reach. She stayed behind, trapped in the hotel. Since then, we haven't had a word from her. No apology. No remorse. In fact, she accused me of using David. She called me immoral, claiming that I'd only married him for his money and his youth. She even went so far as to say that I couldn't find anyone like him now that I was used up. Those were her exact words. I could see it in her eyes. She had been waiting for the right moment to humiliate me, to tear me down. But she never imagined that David wouldn't stand by her side when she was clearly in the wrong. We cut her out of our lives for good, and we haven't looked back. Despite everything, David and I decided not to cut our trip short. We wanted the kids to have a chance to enjoy the vacation, to escape the shadow of that terrifying ordeal. But then, just the day after, Frankie took a flight back home with her children. She thanked us for trying to make the best of the situation, but admitted she just couldn't stay after what had happened. She told us she'd never let Freda near her children again. She even sent an email to Freda, informing her that any future contact would result in a restraining order. 2 weeks have passed since we returned home, and things have been strained. David has been distant. His mother, Freda, is still in Miami, facing jail time. The trial is approaching, and David's mood has soured even further. Yesterday, I confronted him. He confessed that he wasn't just upset about his mother's troubles, he was upset with me too. He said he was hurt because I hadn't told him sooner about the way his mother treated us. He believed that had he known earlier, things wouldn't have escalated to this point. I can't help but feel conflicted. I know he's right in some ways, but it feels like he's blaming me. That maybe, if I had just spoken up earlier, none of this would have happened. I don't know. We haven't spoken since that conversation. And now, I'm left wondering what comes next. I found myself at a loss for words, unsure of what to say to David in that moment. I had kept something from him, something so critical, and it was weighing on me heavily. I had concealed how badly his mother had treated me and our son. It wasn't just a small oversight, it was a secret that stretched on far too long, and I could feel the guilt gnawing at me. When I read the responses to my post, a spark of clarity ignited within me. Maybe, just maybe, playing mind games with his mother wasn't the right approach. I had been so wrapped up in protecting myself, but the truth was, my child was the one most at risk. I didn't foresee just how unhinged his mother could get, but that didn't make it right to keep the truth hidden from him. So, I made the decision to apologize. I told David everything. I admitted I was foolish, that I should have trusted him more, and I was deeply sorry for not sharing the weight I was carrying. I had no idea what kind of reaction I was expecting, but what I got was something unexpected. He was understanding, so much more than I could have hoped. In fact, he even apologized to me, saying that his own reactions, when others criticized his mother, might have pushed me away from being open with him. He clarified that his anger wasn't about me, it was about how his family talked about her, as if she were a burden. To him, she wasn't. But, in this case, things were different. He acknowledged how messed up her actions were, and he made it clear that she deserved whatever consequences came her way. A weight lifted from my chest as we talked it through. There was no more tension hanging between us, no more unspoken feelings. We were back to normal, and I felt a sense of relief I hadn't known in weeks. It felt like a small victory, especially after all the advice and support I had received from people who understood what I was going through. The trial had begun. David and I were about to face it head on, and in just a few days, we would be back in Miami for our testimony. The court was covering our expenses, which was a relief, considering it wasn't something we planned for. But, as much as I appreciated that, I knew this wasn't a vacation. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Both of us were feeling nervous, unsure of what to expect. On one hand, we were relieved, even hopeful, that justice would finally be served. I especially felt that relief because I wouldn't have to deal with his mother anymore. But on the other hand, this was still David's mother, the woman he had loved and looked up to for his whole life. And as much as she deserved to face the consequences of her actions, it was hard not to feel a little uneasy. We knew we wouldn't be the only ones testifying against her. The witnesses against her were many, and that was something of a comfort. We wouldn't be standing alone. But we also knew that, as family, we would be the ones who would make the most impact. Frankie, David's sister, might testify too, but the truth was, I didn't know if she would. She had made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with their mother anymore. She'd already banned her from seeing her children, and I couldn't imagine her stepping into this mess. From what we knew, his mother had been placed under house arrest for now. The hotel had refused to let her stay any longer, so she was now staying with a friend, one who, I assumed, was just as deluded as she was. It was hard to wrap my head around it, but somehow, her friends were enabling her. It was no surprise, really, given her history. She had always surrounded herself with people who didn't challenge her. 2 days ago, we landed in Miami. Today was the day we had to testify. Ben was safely at home with the sitter, and as daunting as it felt, we had to push through. The whole process was unnerving, but it was straightforward. I had to tell my side of the story, and it was the same as what everyone else had said, what the hotel staff and the man from the shop had witnessed. It felt strangely validating to hear our stories all align. I didn't feel like there was any chance she could get out of this. Not even the most expensive lawyer could twist the truth enough to save her. She would get jail time, and I was sure of it. Throughout the proceedings, she looked distraught, broken, even. After the trial adjourned, she tried to approach us. But David and we didn't even acknowledge her. We turned away and left. We weren't going to give her the satisfaction of engaging with her. I didn't want to hear her excuses. It wasn't the time for that. David had been unusually quiet since the trial. I understood why. This was harder on him than it was on me, and I didn't blame him for it. It couldn't be easy to stand up against your own mother, no matter what she had done. But he did it, and he did it for me. For Ben. It was the right thing to do, and it took courage. It wasn't easy to face the woman who had been a huge part of his life, but he didn't back down. And I couldn't be prouder of him for that. I know some people might think this is just a small thing, a simple act of standing up for what's right. But I knew how much he loved his mother. He had every reason to make excuses for her, to find a way to protect her, but he chose the right path. And in that moment, I realized just how lucky I was to have him by my side. The verdict had been delivered. Freda was sentenced to a year in jail. A year! Though there was a slight glimmer of hope for her, she could possibly shorten that time with good behavior. I can't say I feel any sympathy for her. Part of me almost hopes she doesn't change. As for the rest of us, it's been a strange relief, knowing she'll be out of our lives for a while. But then, there's this lingering thought, what if she really does come back into our world? That's why we've been debating a restraining order. We don't want to deal with her once she's out, but we're waiting. No point in acting while she's locked up. When she's free again, that's when we'll act. It's sad, honestly. She's being held in a Miami jail, far from everyone who might have cared about her. No visits from friends or family, not that I'd be one of them anyway. And then, my mind circles back to that terrifying day when Ben didn't come home. The fear I felt, imagining what could have been, it all makes everything happening to her feel like a consequence she deserves, and more. No pity left. And David? He didn't even flinch when he heard about her jail time. Just a shrug and a quick remark about hoping it's a lesson learned. We both know what's right, what she's done, and what must be done next. Several months have passed since that court date, and the news arrived, Freda was being let out early. I guess we shouldn't have been surprised. A third-degree felony, yet somehow, she's walking free sooner than expected. But now that it's real, we've decided. Time to file that restraining order we discussed. No second-guessing. Our family's safety comes first. If she dares to come near us, we won't hesitate to call the police. She'll learn that lesson the hard way. The lawyer's already on it, preparing the paperwork. All we're waiting for now is for her to show up, which we're kind of expecting at this point. Her neighbors told us she'd been gone for a while, but last night she returned. What a mess! When we first got word, it felt like everything started moving again. That nagging sense of dread that we thought we could put to rest. We reached out to the lawyer immediately. No hesitation. We're doing this for Ben, for all of us. She can't just waltz back into our lives without consequences. Frankie, of course, was already in the loop. She's been keeping herself distant from Freda, and now she's planning to file a protective order too. I don't blame her. We all know what kind of person Freda is, no matter the ties of blood. She's a danger to everyone. And if Frankie's smart, she'll stay just as far away from her as we are. Meanwhile, we're doing our best to keep Ben in the dark. We don't want him remembering any of this madness. He's been in therapy since we returned, and honestly, he's doing well. If anything, it seems like he's already forgotten what happened with Freda. And honestly, that's the best outcome we could have asked for. This whole ordeal, what she tried to do, it shouldn't even be something he has to remember. But as for her, Freda has paid her legal debt, sure. But there's no forgiveness in my heart for her. What she did, unforgivable. And I'll make sure she stays as far away from us as possible. Through it all, David has been quiet. Too quiet. I can see the weight of this pressing down on him. I know it's harder on him than it is on me. But he's been strong for us. Strong for Ben. He's been the kind of man I could only dream of. The kind who chooses what's right over what's easy. And I couldn't be prouder of him. Not many people would stand up to their own flesh and blood, but he did it. For us. For our family. And I know, deep down, that we're going to be okay. Because of him. Because of us. Together, we've got this.